frozen for more than 5,000 years on a remote mountain pass, and now preserved for the ages in a refrigerated tomb.
The truth about Ötzi the Iceman just changed, not slightly, not a footnote. The most studied prehistoric human in history is not the man the world has been looking at for over a decade. Right now, behind glass in a climate-controlled chamber in Bolzano, a 5,300-year-old body lies a few feet from a life-sized reconstruction that has been wrong since the day it was built.
It's been hailed as one of the century's most important archaeological finds, the body of a Bronze Age mountaineer.
The face is wrong, the skin is wrong, the hair is wrong, the ancestry on every museum placard is wrong. And in August of 2023, a single study finally proved it. Body in the ice. September 19th, 1991, Ötztal Alps. The border between Austria and Italy, 10,530 feet above sea level. Two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were taking a shortcut across a small glacial gully when they saw what they assumed was a discarded doll in the melting ice. It was not a doll. It was a human body.
Two hikers climbing in the Italian Alps wander off the trail and stumble across a gruesome sight. The head and shoulders of a man emerging from the ice. At first, the pathologist responding to the scene assumes it's simply the remains of an unfortunate hiker.
A man in his mid-40s, partially mummified by the cold and freeze-dried by the dry mountain air. He still had hair, he still had skin, he still had teeth. His leather clothing, his copper-headed axe, his bow and quiver were preserved on and around his body. He had been there for approximately 5,300 years. The world would come to call him the Iceman. Within months, he became the most thoroughly studied prehistoric human in scientific history. CT scans, dental analysis, stomach contents reconstruction, pollen identification, tattoo cataloging, wound reconstruction. In 2012, his complete genome was sequenced for the first time, briefly making him the oldest fully sequenced ancient human ever recovered. The portrait that emerged from that sequencing was repeated in every textbook and museum exhibit printed since. But here is where it gets strange. Almost every published detail of what he looked like, where his ancestors came from, and what kind of European he was, almost all of it was contaminated, and no one in the field knew it for the next 11 years. A world about to end. Ötzi died around 3,230 BC, late Neolithic, early Copper Age, a transitional moment when farming communities that had spread across the continent from Anatolia were beginning to develop metallurgy. Stone tools were still in use. Copper was becoming a prestige material. The Alps in this period were not empty wilderness.
The Copper Age falls between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. These ages occurred at different times in different places, but generally followed the same order of development.
They were a landscape of seasonal exploitation, with high pastures used for summer grazing and mountain passes used for trade between the valleys of what are now Austria, Italy, and Switzerland. Ötzi was part of this world. He died in a shallow depression in the mountains, probably in late spring or early summer based on pollen evidence. His body was quickly covered by snow that compressed into ice. The location was sheltered enough that the ice did not flow, unlike a glacier, which would have crushed the remains. Cold enough that the body was preserved in a freeze-dried state for over 5 millennia. When the Simons found him in 1991, Ötzi was emerging from a melting ice patch during an unusually warm late summer. A few more years of warming, and he would have been destroyed. A few years earlier, and he would have stayed hidden. The timing was extraordinarily fortunate. The recovery was not. The initial extraction was conducted with jackhammers, ski poles, and other improvised tools. The workers who freed him did not understand what they had found. The clothing was torn. The bow was broken. Hands were everywhere on him before anyone realized what they were touching. Bare hands, multiple shifts of personnel, days of exposure on a mountainside before specialists arrived. By the time archaeologists understood the significance of what had been found, Ötzi had already been touched, lifted, repositioned, and sampled by people who had no reason to think any of it mattered. It mattered. Every fingerprint, every drop of sweat, Every speck of skin transferred during those days had deposited modern human DNA directly onto a 5,300-year-old body. That detail will matter later, more than anyone realized at the time. A kit from a lost world. What survived the recovery was still extraordinary. The artifacts preserved with Ötzi constitute the most complete personal equipment assemblage ever recovered from European prehistory. His copper-headed axe was the most diagnostic object. The blade was nearly pure copper, hafted to a yew wood handle with leather straps and birch bark tar.
You can just see here at least 3 different kinds of material. You see grass, you see skin, and you see cord.
The metallurgy was more sophisticated than many researchers had assumed Copper Age alpine communities possessed. His clothing was made from at least 4 different animal species: goat, sheep, cattle, and bear, skilled tailoring throughout. The ensemble included a grass-stuffed shoe system, a leather belt with a pouch, and a bearskin cap. His weapons included a longbow unfinished at the time of his death, a quiver with 14 arrows, of which only 2 were ready to use, and a flint-bladed knife with an ashwood handle. His body bore 61 tattoos, groups of parallel lines and crosses, located primarily at joints and along the spine. The placement corresponds closely to acupuncture points used in traditional Chinese medicine, suggesting either an ancient Eurasian therapeutic tradition or a convergent discovery of the same anatomical logic. His stomach contained his last meal: ibex, red deer, einkorn wheat, and bracken fern, consumed within hours of his death. Take a moment, hit the like button, subscribe if you have not already. The story of who this man actually was, and what was done to him in the high mountains, is unlike anything you have heard before. The second half is where everything you thought you knew falls apart. Running for his life. The cause of death was not obvious at first. Initial examinations suggested various possibilities: exhaustion, exposure, a fall. The body showed signs of trauma, but the cold and the mummification made interpretation difficult. The breakthrough came in 2001, 10 years into the study, when X-ray analysis revealed something everyone had missed. A flint arrowhead was lodged in his left shoulder. The arrow had entered from behind and severed a major artery. He had been shot in the back. The wound would have been fatal within minutes. CT scans in 2007 added more. Blunt force injury to the head, possibly inflicted shortly before or after the arrow wound. The violence of his death was unmistakable. But the strangest part was not on his body, it was on his weapons.
Is that we have no way of knowing if there are still living organisms in the mummy itself, and if these would be reactivated in the defrosting.
Analysis of bloodstains on his equipment and clothing identified DNA from 4 different individuals, none of them matching the Iceman himself. 4 people had bled on his gear. The evidence suggests a violent confrontation involving multiple participants. He had fought with several attackers and injured them before someone shot him from behind. Isotope analysis of his teeth and bones established that he grew up in the Isaac Valley region of South Tyrol, approximately 60 kilometers south of where he died. In the final months or years of his life, he had been living in the lower Vinschgau Valley, but he died high in the mountains, in a pass that connected the valleys of what are now Austria and Italy. Why was he there? The theories proliferated. He was fleeing enemies. He was a shepherd. He was a trader. He was a copper prospector. He was a shaman. None of these has been confirmed. What is confirmed is that someone wanted him dead badly enough to follow him into the high mountains and shoot him in the back. And for 30 years, that was the most shocking thing about him. It was not. The genome was wrong. The 2012 sequencing was supposed to complete his story. The study, published in Nature Communications by a team led by Andreas Keller and Albert Zink, produced what was then the highest quality ancient genome ever recovered from human remains of this age. The findings were widely reported and almost immediately accepted. The team concluded that Ötzi belonged to Y chromosome haplogroup G2A, a lineage associated with early Neolithic farmers who had spread into Europe from Anatolia beginning around 7000 BC. He was a descendant of farming populations. He carried genetic signatures from both the Anatolian farming migration and from European hunter-gatherer populations, a profile consistent with most modern Europeans. He likely had brown eyes. He may have had light skin. museum reconstructions were updated to reflect these findings. The life-size model in Bolzano depicted a man with light skin, brown eyes, and a full head of dark, wavy hair. The portrait was reproduced in books, documentaries, and educational materials worldwide. Now look at this. Ancient DNA is fragile. After thousands of years, the original genetic material degrades into short fragments, mixed with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, and most problematically, DNA from every human who has handled the specimen since its discovery. The signal of who someone really was can end up buried under the signal of who touched them last. Remember the recovery in 1991. Workers without gloves, multiple transfers, researchers from dozens of institutions taking samples in the years that followed. Every single touch had deposited DNA. The techniques available in 2012 could distinguish ancient DNA from modern contamination to some degree, but not perfectly, not even close. In August of 2023, Frank Meixner at the Institute for Mummy Studies at URAC Research in Bolzano, working with Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and his postdoctoral researcher Kay Wang as first author, published in Cell Genomics the results of a complete high-coverage resequencing of the Iceman's genome. The technology they used had not existed in 2012. The contamination protocols had been refined dramatically over the intervening decade. Meixner's team had been waiting, quietly, for the methods to catch up to the questions they had not been able to answer the first time. When the new data came back in Bolzano, it took the team time to accept what the numbers were saying. Kay Wang ran the contamination estimate, then ran it again, then ran it a third way. The figure kept landing in the same place. Approximately 10% of the sequence reads, in the 2012 study represented modern human DNA contamination, primarily deposited during the chaotic 1990s recovery period. 10%. In ancient DNA work, 10% is a catastrophe, and the contamination was not random. The modern DNA came from Europeans, people whose ancestry profiles included substantial Western hunter-gatherer and steppe-related components. When that modern DNA mixed into the analysis, it shifted Ötzi's apparent ancestry. It made him look more like a modern European. It made him look less like what he actually was. What he actually was, it turned out, was someone almost no one had ever seen before. The real Iceman. The corrected genome tells a different story. Ötzi's actual ancestry is approximately 91% derived from early Anatolian Neolithic farmers. That number is so high, it should not be possible. By 3230 BC, most European populations had already become significantly mixed. The original Anatolian farmers, who had spread across Europe beginning around 7000 BC, had intermarried with indigenous hunter-gatherer populations over thousands of years. The resulting hybrid populations carried substantial ancestry from both groups. Ötzi does not fit this pattern. His genome shows very little Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, far less than any European of his time period should have, and he shows essentially no steppe ancestry at all. This is the part the team had to verify and re-verify before they would publish. They re-ran the analysis with different reference populations. They tested it against alternative contamination models. They cross-checked against other ancient genomes from roughly the same period and the same region. The number kept holding. Beginning around 3000 BC, roughly contemporary with Ötzi's lifetime, populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe began migrating into Europe. These steppe peoples, associated with the Yamnaya archaeological culture, would transform the genetic landscape of the continent. Within a few centuries, their genetic signature would appear in populations from Iberia to Scandinavia. Modern Europeans carry substantial steppe ancestry. It is one of the defining features of European population genetics. Ötzi has none of it. His genome is a snapshot of a population that had not yet experienced the steppe migrations that would reshape Europe. But more than that, it suggests he came from an unusually isolated population. His ancestors had stayed relatively unmixed since arriving in the Alpine region thousands of years earlier. They had not intermarried extensively with neighboring groups. They had held a profile closer to the original Neolithic farmers than nearly any of their contemporaries. The Alps had been a refuge. While the rest of Europe was mixing, an entire community had been holding still in the mountains for generations. Ötzi was not a typical Copper Age European. He was a remnant, a holdout, a representative of a demographic layer that was about to be erased. And that was only the first half of what the resequencing found. Darker and balder. The physical appearance findings were where the museum reconstructions started to fall apart in real time. Ötzi likely had light skin, an adaptation associated with farming populations in northern latitudes, where reduced sunlight made lighter pigmentation advantageous for vitamin D synthesis. The 2023 study found the opposite. Ötzi carried genetic variants associated with significantly darker skin pigmentation than the museum reconstruction depicted. The fair-skinned Iceman in the museum displays was a contamination artifact. The modern European DNA that had mixed into his samples carried the light-skinned variants that characterize contemporary Europeans. When that contamination was removed, the actual ancient genome showed a different picture entirely. Ötzi was darker skinned than modern Europeans. This finding lines up with emerging research on ancient European pigmentation. The light skin that characterizes modern Europeans appears to have become widespread only in the last 5,000 years, roughly contemporary with or after Ötzi's lifetime. He represented a population that had not yet undergone the adaptation. Then came the baldness. Ötzi carried genetic markers strongly associated with male pattern baldness. Given that he was in his mid-40s at the time of his death, he was likely already balding, possibly significantly so. The museum reconstructions showing him with a full head of dark wavy hair were not mostly right, they were not partially right, they were almost entirely fabricated by contamination. The man who walked into the mountains 5,300 years ago was probably bald or balding on top, with darker skin than any modern European reconstruction had ever suggested. With an ancestry profile that marked him as a genetic outlier even in his own time. And the world had been looking at the wrong face for over a decade without knowing. It gets worse when you ask how often that has happened to someone else. A warning in the ice. Johannes Krauss has spent his career at the front of this revolution. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, where he serves as director, has produced many of the foundational studies that reshaped human prehistory over the past 15 years. He has watched the field rebuild itself around new techniques every 2 or 3 years. He understands, better than almost anyone, what older sequencing technology could not see. Frank Meixner, in Bolzano, has been studying Ötzi for over a decade. The man behind the glass at the museum is not just a research subject for him. The 2012 portrait was the portrait Meixner had spent 10 years explaining to the public, defending to journalists, citing in his own work, and then his own team helped take it apart. The other surprise sitting inside the Iceman's body was not in his nuclear DNA at all. It was in his stomach. The Helicobacter pylori bacteria living in Ötzi's gut, sequenced by Meixner's team in earlier work, matched a strain associated with South Asian populations rather than the strains found in modern Europeans. That alone hinted at human migration patterns, far more complicated than the textbook version. Combined with the corrected genome, the picture sharpens. Ötzi was carrying signals from 2 different layers of human history at once, and the field had been reading both of them through a fog. When the contamination figures came back, the team had to work through what the implications were, not just for Ötzi, but for every other genome of comparable age, sequenced before 2018. Studies built on that older technology may carry the same hidden errors. The Ötzi resequencing is not an isolated case, it is a warning shot. How many other ancient individuals are currently described in textbooks with faces that are partially fabricated by 20th century lab contamination? No one knows yet. The field is starting to find out. The man ice gave back. Right now, today, as you watch this, the reconstruction in Bolzano still shows the wrong face. The fair skin, the full head of dark hair, the ancestry profile that placed him neatly inside the standard story of European origins. The museum will need to update the figure, the placards, the educational materials, the exhibit text, the audio guides, the gift shop merchandise, the children's books printed in 3 languages and stocked in the lobby. Some of that work has begun, most of it has not. But Ötzi is not the only ancient human currently misrepresented in a glass case somewhere in the world. He is just the one we caught. Every genome sequenced before roughly 2018 was sequenced with technology that could not fully separate ancient DNA from the fingerprints of the people who handled the bones. Every reconstruction built on those genomes carries some unknown margin of error. Some of those errors will be small. Some of them, the next time someone resequences, will land like the 10% that rewrote Ötzi. There are hundreds of those genomes. There are reconstructions in dozens of museums on 3 continents that were built on the same generation of technology. He was shot in the back at 10,530 feet, 5,300 years ago, by people whose names will never be known. He was found by 2 German hikers who thought he was a doll. He was extracted with jackhammers, handled by ungloved strangers, and described to the world for 30 years through a face that was not his. The man who was murdered in those mountains spent more than 3 decades being misrepresented to every person who came to look at him. And the version of him you can still walk up to in Bolzano today is the contaminated one. The truth about Ötzi did not change because the past changed. It changed because the technology finally caught up, and the technology is still catching up. Look around at every other reconstruction in every other museum and ask which one is next. Because someone, somewhere, is currently the most famous ancient human you have never seen correctly. And the next study has not been published yet. If this changed what you thought you knew about Ötzi, drop a comment below with the one detail that surprised you most. Was it the darker skin, the baldness, the 91% Anatolian ancestry, or the fact that the entire portrait was wrong for 11 years? Hit subscribe for more stories where the science just rewrote everything we thought was settled. The next discovery is already being sequenced.